1991 was a year of dramatic change across Eastern Europe and beyond. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, leading to German reunification in 1990. And in 1991, Czechoslovakia split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And on Christmas Day 1991, Poland, Hungary, Austria, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Spain, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Portugal, and Greece all met together in Madrid to sign the Treaty of European Union, laying the groundwork for the creation of the EU as we know it today. But it wasn't just in Europe where change was afoot. Across the globe in the Caucasus Mountains, one of our smallest republics, Armenia, was undergoing its own profound transformation. From the fall of the mighty Soviet Union on December 26, 1991, Armenia became an independent republic, or in Russian, Respublika, for the first time in nearly 70 years. So in this episode of our series exploring the histories of the world's nations, let's look back to 1991 and explore how Armenia was reborn. The year before, in 1990, Armenia had declared its independence from the crumbling Soviet Union, but it wasn't until a year later that they broke away completely. Before then, Armenia had existed for only a brief time as an independent republic between 1918 and 1920 during the chaos of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. However, the First Republic of Armenia was wiped out when it was invaded and incorporated into the Soviet Union as the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. One of 15 constituent republics of the USSR, Armenia was heavily industrialized and urbanized during its Soviet period. Education and literacy rates soared, and despite heavy-handed Soviet policies, the Armenian Apostolic Church survived underground. National identity was preserved, but without much autonomy. Armenia was tightly integrated into the Soviet economy, and its people had no voice in setting policy. In the late 1980s, however, everything changed. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power as the leader of the Soviet Union, he introduced sweeping reforms aimed at opening up the Soviet Union, Glasnost, meaning openness, and restructuring the stagnating economy, Perestroika, meaning restructuring. This reform program gave citizens more rights and freedoms and opened the door to discussing issues that had been taboo under previous Soviet leaders. In Armenia, this freedom unleashed a wave of activism. Two issues dominated the agenda. The first was growing concern over the safety of the Metsamor nuclear power plant near the capital city of Yerevan, which had been built in the 1970s in a seismically active zone. Then there was the decades-long conflict over the mountainous region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which at the time was a part of neighboring Soviet Azerbaijan but had a majority ethnic Armenian population. For decades, Armenians had protested the region's incorporation into Soviet Azerbaijan, and now activists felt empowered to demand the region's transfer to Armenia. Mass demonstrations and strikes erupted throughout Armenia in the late 1980s, combining environmentalism, nationalism, and democratization. These protests continued throughout 1988 and 1990, steadily increasing in scale and scope, but the Soviet state responded with brutal crackdowns, including the January killings of 1990, when Soviet police killed several hundred protesters. Yet, despite the violence, public opposition to the Soviet government continued to grow. In Armenia, the tide turned decisively in September 1991, when a delegation from neighboring Azerbaijan visited Moscow to discuss the future status of Nagorno-Karabakh. After months of negotiations, the three leaders of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the Soviet Union agreed to hold a referendum across the entire USSR to decide whether the country should remain united. It was an attempt by Soviet leader Gorbachev to prevent the dissolution of the Soviet Union. On March 17, 1991, along with many other republics, Armenia boycotted the vote. Then, on September 21, 1991, Armenia held its own referendum on independence, with over 99% of voters casting ballots in favor of leaving the Soviet Union. 3 days later, the Supreme Council of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic adopted the Declaration of the Republic of Armenia, formally declaring the country's independence. At midnight on December 26, 1991, the leaders of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, and Russia signed the Belaveza Accords, effectively dissolving the Soviet Union and marking the end of the Cold War. The next day, Robert Kocharyan, chairman of the Supreme Council of Armenia, officially declared the country's independence to the world. On December 27th, the government of Armenia appealed to the international community to recognize it as a sovereign state. It was soon thereafter admitted to the United Nations and many other international organizations. The country's borders were established as the same as those of the former Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, and in the years since, the country has maintained close ties with Russia, partly due to having hosted many Russian troops who had been stationed in Armenia while it was part of the Soviet Union. And that brings us to today. So, what is life like in Armenia today? What has shaped the country since 1991? Well, when independence was declared, Armenia was left in a precarious state. The country inherited a massive debt burden from the Soviet Union and found itself embroiled in the long-running conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, which had been part of Soviet Azerbaijan, but with an ethnic Armenian majority. After a bloody 6-year war, Armenia had secured control of Nagorno-Karabakh and surrounding regions, but at a tremendous cost. The war had claimed tens of thousands of lives and caused severe economic damage to both countries. The conflict continues to simmer and poses an ongoing challenge to regional stability. To make matters worse, Armenia lost access to energy supplies from neighboring Azerbaijan after the two countries went to war in the early 1990s. This has forced Armenia to rely on Russia for natural gas and electricity, making it vulnerable to energy price increases and supply disruptions. Additionally, Armenia faces economic challenges due to its mountainous terrain and limited arable land, which restricts agricultural production and makes transportation difficult. These geographical constraints have hindered economic growth and development, particularly in rural areas. Despite these difficulties, Armenia has made significant strides in recent decades. It has diversified its economy and developed a thriving information technology sector. Many young people are employed in Armenia's burgeoning tech industry, and the country has become known as a regional hub for startups and outsourcing. Moreover, Armenia has a rich cultural heritage dating back centuries. The country's ancient monasteries, churches, and historical sites draw tourists from around the world. However, challenges remain. Armenia continues to grapple with poverty, inequality, and corruption. Although the country has made progress in some areas, corruption still persists and hampers economic growth. Furthermore, the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh continues to pose a threat to regional stability and diverts resources away from pressing domestic issues. Politically, Armenia has transitioned to a parliamentary democracy. However, concerns remain regarding the level of press freedom and the influence of oligarchs and foreign powers such as Russia. The country has experienced protests and calls for greater political reform and transparency. In conclusion, Armenia's journey since 1991 has been one of resilience and adaptation. From the collapse of the Soviet Union, the country has faced numerous challenges, including the war over Nagorno-Karabakh, economic hardships, and political uncertainties. However, Armenia has demonstrated a remarkable ability to overcome these obstacles. Through the efforts of its people, the country has rebuilt its economy, preserved its cultural heritage, and developed a vibrant democracy. As Armenia continues to navigate the complexities of the 21st century, it is important to remember the struggles and sacrifices of those who fought for the country's independence and those who continue to work towards a brighter future. While the road ahead may hold new challenges, Armenia's history has shown that with unity, determination, and a commitment to democracy, it can continue to thrive as a sovereign and independent nation. That's it for this episode. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like the video, please do leave a like. It helps me to keep making these videos. Thanks for watching.